He let me rewrite this entire story in my mind, believing that we were both on the same page, that this day would be our moment. All the while, he had been planning this behind my back, orchestrating every detail of the betrayal. As I stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of the situation started to hit me. I could hear the soft murmurs of guests greeting each other, unaware of the chaos that was unfolding. Rachel, my supposed friend, smiled up at David, her hand resting on his arm like she was a bride. I felt like the air was sucked out of the room. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tear them both apart with my words, but I couldn't. Instead, my legs moved on their own, carrying me forward to the sea of guests, through the smiling faces, until I was standing right in front of David. "David, what the hell is this?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady, a fire burning in my eyes. He didn't look surprised to see me. Instead, he gave me that same calm, almost apologetic look that he always did when he was trying to manipulate me into believing he was in the right. "I told you I was doing what's best," he said softly, like he was trying to calm me down, like I was the one overreacting. "Best? What's best about this?" I choked out, gesturing to the scene around us. Martha appeared then, slipping into the room like a shadow, standing next to David with a smug smile. "You didn't think we'd let you marry him, did you?" she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You never really fit into our family, and we knew you weren't the right choice for David." I wanted to punch her. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, but instead, all I could do was stare at David. "You let her do this. You let her control everything. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me." I asked, my voice cracking at the end. David looked at me with pity, like he was the one who had been wronged. "You didn't understand. We just want what's best for you two. We didn't think you'd ever be happy with us." That was when it hit me. The man I had trusted, the man I had loved, wasn't the person I thought he was. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This was part of a plan that had been in the works for months, maybe longer. They had been slowly chipping away at my confidence, my plans, my happiness, until I was so far removed from the situation that they could do whatever they wanted without me fighting back. Tears started to form in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked out. There was no use in trying to reason with them, not when they had already made up their minds. Outside, I took a deep breath, the cool air doing little to calm the storm inside me. But I knew one thing: this wasn't over. If they thought they could take my wedding from me, they were in for a nasty surprise. I would fight back, even if it meant losing everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. And as I drove away from the venue, I made a vow to myself. I would rebuild. I would find someone who truly respected me, who would never try to tear me down. I didn't need David or Martha. I needed to be free. But for now, I would focus on the one thing that mattered: taking control of my life again. I stood there, heart racing, but my face calm. I had already spent thousands of dollars, money I would never get back. I had let myself believe I was about to marry the love of my life. The fairy tale had been mine to hold. At least that's what I had thought. But in reality, he had been planning to marry someone else all along. He thought he could make me the fool, make me wake up and realize my wedding was canceled, all while disappearing from my life like I was just some random girl he'd once dated. But they were wrong. They thought I would just roll over, that I would quietly disappear. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't going anywhere. As the guests laughed and chatted, taking their seats in preparation for the ceremony, I stood frozen at the back of the venue. The atmosphere was lively, unaware of the storm brewing. I was no longer just a bride walking down the aisle. I was a woman taking back what was stolen from her. This wasn't a normal wedding. It was a hijacking. Martha stood proudly at the front, beaming with satisfaction, probably thinking she had pulled off the perfect crime. Rachel, my maid of honor, adjusted my veil with a glowing, fake smile, looking like the perfect angel. And David, he stood there unfazed. His face was blank, but his eyes held no guilt, no panic, no regret. He wasn't looking around for me, wondering where I was, because he already knew. Something inside me snapped. I should have cried. I should have been furious. But instead, a strange calmness washed over me. The woman who had been wronged, the woman who had lost everything, was not going to crumble. They took my dress, my venue, my fiancé, my wedding, everything. But I wasn't gone yet. I straightened my shoulders and started walking forward. A few guests glanced at me, some with confusion, some with recognition. Whispers began, but no one stepped in to stop me. Not until I reached the front row. That's when Martha's eyes locked onto mine. For the first time, I saw fear in them. She stood up quickly, stepping in front of me, tried to block me physically as if she could stop me from ruining her fantasy. "You need to leave," she hissed, her voice low and threatening. I didn't flinch. I smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Actually, I think I'll stay," I said, my voice carrying through the room. The whispers grew louder. People nudged each other, some excited, others confused. I noticed my cousin Rebecca staring at me, eyes wide in shock. And then my gaze landed on Sarah, my maid of honor and best friend. Her face was pale, her body stiff. I could see it in her eyes, guilt. She knew what had happened, and she had been part of it. My stomach twisted. The betrayal from my fiancé, from Rachel, from his psycho mother, they all stung, but Sarah? That was the real gut punch. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to offer some half-hearted excuse, but I wasn't in the mood to hear it. I turned back to Martha, who was still trying to assert control over the situation. "You weren't invited," Martha said through gritted teeth, forcing a smile. I laughed, loud and sharp. "Really? Because last I checked, this was my wedding." David turned at the sound of my voice, his blank expression faltering just slightly. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. But he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He already knew this was coming. I could see it in his eyes. Rachel, standing next to him, went pale. Her body stiffened, realizing that the game was up, but it was too late. David stepped forward, his voice calm, rehearsed. "Let's not do this here," he said, his tone practiced like he'd been preparing for this moment. I tilted my head, narrowing my eyes. "Oh, but you wanted to do this here, didn't you?" I gestured around the venue. "You planned this whole thing behind my back, didn't you?" Rachel tried to grab David's arm, as if she could somehow stop this from escalating. "Look, we didn't." I cut her off, my voice like a whip. "You didn't what?" "Rachel, you didn't steal my fiancé? You didn't wear my wedding dress? You didn't let me plan my own wedding while you waited in the background to take my place?" Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I turned back to David, looking him dead in the eye. "How long, David?" I asked, my voice cold. "How long have you been planning this?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. "How long?" I repeated, louder this time. Rachel fidgeted. "It just happened," she said, her voice shaky. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "It just happened," I repeated mockingly. "Oh, so you just tripped and fell into my wedding dress? Into my fiancé's bed?" Martha sighed dramatically, trying to make it all go away. "Stop making a scene," she snapped. I snapped my head toward her. "You planned this, didn't you?" She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to argue. Her silence spoke volumes. I nodded, a cold, detached feeling spreading through me. "You know, Martha," I said, taking a step closer to her, lowering my voice so only she could hear. I was so ready to be the bigger person. I was willing to marry your son and tolerate you for the rest of my life. But now, I paused, savoring the moment. Now I'm going to destroy you. Martha flinched, her hand shaking slightly. David finally spoke, his voice too calm, too controlled. "It's over. Let's just move on." "Move on?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Move on from what?" "From everything you've stolen from me." I pulled out my phone and hit play. The speakers in the venue crackled to life, and Martha's voice blasted through the room. "We've taken your dress. The venue is canceled, and your fiancé knows what's best. Rachel is better suited for me. She'll be a proper wife," Martha's voice said. Gasps echoed throughout the room. The crowd went silent. David's face drained of color, his eyes wide with panic. I glanced toward Rachel. She took a step away from David, horrified by the sudden shift in power. David's face was twisted in a mask of shock. "Babe, I'm sorry, but my mom is right," he said, his voice shaking. "You're just not good enough. Rachel is better suited for me. She'll be a proper wife." The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the faint sound of the champagne glass shattering in the distance. I took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. I leaned in and locked eyes with Rachel. "Still want him?" I asked, my voice a low, challenging whisper. She bolted, her eyes wide with terror, disappearing into the crowd. Martha turned to David, fury in her eyes. "You told her that?" she hissed, but David was still frozen. His mind couldn't process how badly everything was spiraling. I pulled out another piece of paper, unfolding it slowly. "You know what else I have?" I said, my voice soft but menacing. "The bill for the wedding." Martha's eyes narrowed. "What?" she whispered. I smirked. "David and I signed financial agreements before the wedding. That means he owes me for everything," I said, reading the number from the paper. $35,000. David's face was pure horror as he realized what was happening. "That's not." I shrugged. "It's in writing. Signed. Legal." Then I smiled, sickeningly sweet. "And if you don't pay me back, well..." I leaned in close to Martha, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You know I love a good public scandal." Martha's face was drained of color. David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I turned to the crowd, who were now watching intently, some of them recording the entire scene on their phones. "Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the show," I said, my voice smooth and cold, "because it's not over yet." David looked like a rat caught in a trap. Martha's mouth moved, but no words came out. She was speechless, trapped in her own deceit. I wasn't going anywhere, not until they understood the price of betrayal. The room was frozen. My best friend, Sarah, stood motionless, caught in a web of guilt, unable to meet my gaze. The weight of the moment crushed me. I hadn't finished, not by a long shot. The words were still boiling inside me, aching to break free, but the sight of her was holding me back. David had taken everything from me, my wedding, my dignity, my heart. His mother, Martha, had made sure of it. Together, they orchestrated the perfect betrayal, manipulating every detail to ensure I was too humiliated, too broken to fight back. They underestimated me, though, and now, as the truth came crashing down, I was going to ruin them piece by piece. Martha opened her mouth, no doubt preparing to launch into some screeching excuse, but before she could utter a single word, the door slammed open. A man in a sharp, tailored suit walked in, carrying a briefcase that clicked against the floor as he moved. "Apologies for the interruption." His voice echoed with authority, drawing every eye in the room. David's face turned ashen, his blood draining from his face. The man walked toward me, and I could see the recognition in his eyes. He gave a small, respectful nod. "Miss, my name. Everything is in order," he said with a professional calmness. I smiled, a cold, victorious smile that felt foreign on my lips. The timing was impeccable. Martha's eyes nearly bugged out of her head. She grabbed David's arm, holding on to him as though she could stop him from crumbling under the weight of his own actions. "You got a lawyer?" she spat, her voice dripping with disbelief and venom. "Of course I did," I replied, my tone icy. "You and your son stole my wedding, my money, and my time. You really thought I wouldn't get some legal backup?" The guests around us began to murmur in shock, their whispers filling the air with an electric tension. David's face contorted into something resembling disbelief as he stammered, trying to find his voice. "This is ridiculous," he sneered, but my lawyer didn't even glance at him. He simply continued, his tone unshaken. "According to financial agreement signed prior to this event, you, David, are legally bound to cover all wedding expenses. That comes to a total of $335,000. David's breath hitched. He choked on air, his face going a sickly shade of pale as the reality of his situation set in. The lawyer wasn't finished. "Non-negotiable," he added coolly, flipping to the briefcase and pulling out a contract. "You planned this wedding and swapped out the bride at the last minute. That means legally your son is now responsible for the full bill." The room was dead silent for a moment, and then the air seemed to crackle with gasps, the murmurs rising to a crescendo. I could almost hear the gasps of the guests in stereo, a chorus of disbelief and shock. Even the waiters were stifling laughs, pretending to cough in an attempt to hide the irony. Martha went ballistic. "This is a scam," she shrieked, her face contorted with fury and frustration. But the lawyer stood his ground. "No, ma'am. It's legally binding." He didn't even flinch as her rage swirled around him. "You plan to replace your future daughter-in-law with another woman. You now owe every penny. You have until the end of the day before legal action is taken." A waiter, clearly struggling to maintain composure, coughed loudly, and someone from the crowd muttered under their breath, "Holy shit." Just then, a shaky voice pierced through the tension in the room. "Wait," Sarah spoke, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear what she had to say, but she had caught my attention. David whipped his head toward her in panic, his expression contorting with fear. "Sarah, don't," he muttered through clenched teeth, but she shook her head, determined. "I knew," Sarah choked out, her voice breaking. "I knew about the plan. I couldn't keep lying to you." She wiped her eyes furiously, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Martha told me weeks ago. She told me they were planning to replace you. She said you weren't the right kind of wife for David." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My stomach dropped as I stared at Sarah, my best friend. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice hoarse with disbelief. "You knew and you didn't tell me?" Sarah's face flushed with shame, her voice barely audible as she spoke. "I wanted to warn you. I really did. But Martha," she threatened me. "She said if I told you, she'd ruin me. She said she'd make sure I lost my job. She trailed off, unable to continue, her face filled with regret. "Your job?" I asked, my mind racing. Sarah's gaze fell to the ground, her shoulders sagging. "Martha owns a firm I work at," she murmured. "She said she'd fire me if I told you. I was weak. I'm sorry." The room erupted into whispers, some guests muttering under their breath, others outright disgusted by the revelation. The truth hung heavy in the air. I could barely process what Sarah had just admitted, but I turned my focus back to Martha and David. "So, you really threatened my best friend's job just to get rid of me?" I asked, the words slipping out like venom. Martha rolled her eyes, as if it were all so simple, so beneath her. "It's called handling problems," she sneered, arms crossed as she looked down her nose at us all. Unbelievable. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She turned toward David, hands shaking as she pointed at him. "Tell her the rest, David," she demanded. "Tell her everything." The room went deathly quiet. Even Martha looked on with a mix of anxiety and anger, but David stood frozen, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Martha snapped at Sarah, her voice like a whip. "Sarah, don't you dare." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She raised her voice. "Tell her, David." Silence. The kind of silence that felt like a bomb waiting to go off. David's shoulders slumped. The weight of the moment was too much for him to bear, and with a final, defeated exhale, he muttered the words I never thought I'd hear. "Rachel's pregnant." The room exploded into chaos. I staggered backward, the world spinning around me. Pregnant. My voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible as the truth sank in. Rachel, my friend, the woman who had stolen my fiancé, wore my dress, tried to take my wedding, and now she was pregnant with his child. And I was supposed to just walk away, let them ruin me without a fight. David tried to reach for me, but I took a step back. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking with fury. I turned to Martha, my voice icy with realization. "So, that's what this was about. That's why you wanted me gone. Rachel is giving your son an heir." My laugh was bitter. How quaint. How medieval. I felt the cold sting of betrayal deep in my bones, but I didn't care anymore. I had nothing left to lose. I turned to the guests, the crowd still whispering in shock, some laughing nervously at the drama unfolding before them. "Everyone, let's give a big round of applause to David and Rachel, who are expecting a child after stabbing me in the back," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. The word stung. but they felt liberating. Someone from the crowd actually clapped. Another voice muttered, "I need more popcorn." David looked crushed, his eyes hollow with regret, but it was too late for apologies. Too late for redemption. I was seething, every muscle in my body tight with anger, but I had to stay composed. I turned to my lawyer, my voice low but firm. "Are we good?" He gave me a subtle nod. "I'll handle the rest." Perfect. It was time to execute the next part of my plan. I smoothed down my suit, straightening the lapels, feeling the weight of the situation settling over me. This wasn't just about the wedding. No, this was much bigger than that. The lies, the betrayal, the people I had trusted, all of it was coming to a head. I was done being a victim in this story. I had one more move to make. And this was just the beginning. I should have left. I wanted to leave. I could feel the satisfaction of walking out, letting them deal with the mess they had created. But something inside me, some gut feeling, told me I wasn't finished yet. I wasn't walking away until I knew the truth. The truth. The one thing still missing from all of this. I turned back toward David, who was standing at the altar, rubbing his temples like he was fighting off a headache. His expression screamed frustration, as if I was just some problem to solve, some inconvenience to sweep away. Meanwhile, Martha was fuming in the back, muttering to herself. She shot a glare at Sarah, one so venomous I was certain could burn through steel. I wouldn't have been surprised if she tried to set Sarah on fire, with just a look. And the guests, oh, they were eating it up. A few had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others were already pulling out their phones, eager to capture the drama for social media. This was it, the spectacle of a lifetime. Then Rachel walked back in. She looked furious, not guilty, not embarrassed. Furious. She marched down the aisle in her wedding dress, still acting like she belonged there, like she wasn't the one who'd stolen everything from me. I raised an eyebrow, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I ruin your big day?" Rachel crossed her arms tightly, her breath coming in sharp, angry bursts. "You just had to ruin everything," she snapped, her voice laced with venom. I couldn't help but laugh. It came out bitter, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed through the room. "Actually," I said, sarcasm dripping from my voice, "you're unbelievable. What part of this did you think I wouldn't find out? The part where you stole my fiancé? The part where you wore my dress? Or maybe the part where you're pregnant with his baby?" I saw the flicker of something in Rachel's eyes. A shift? Something that made her pause. That was not supposed to come out. She flinched, and I knew then that I had hit a nerve. David groaned, pressing his fingers to his forehead like he was trying to block out the world. "Rachel, stop talking," he muttered under his breath. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened. Rachel wasn't stopping now. She looked at me, eyes wild, and sneered. "You think I'm the bad guy? You have no idea what I was promised," she said, her voice shaking but full of conviction. The room fell silent. The air seemed to thicken. David's head jerked up, his eyes flashing with panic. "Rachel, shut up." But she didn't. She kept going, the words tumbling out like they had been waiting to be set free. "They promised me everything," Rachel hissed, the bitterness dripping from every word. "A perfect life. They promised me that David would marry me, that we'd be this perfect couple, the new face of their family." She laughed. But there was no humor in it, only the sound of someone who had been sold a lie. My stomach turned. So this had been the plan all along. David and Martha, they had planned this long before today. Rachel wasn't some unwitting victim in this story. She was a replacement, the one Martha had handpicked, dressed up, and paraded around like a doll. Rachel's voice wavered, but she didn't back down. "I was never supposed to be the wife. I was just a tool, a way to get rid of you." Her eyes shot to Martha, her gaze filled with accusation. "And once the baby is here," Rachel's voice trailed off for a moment as she took a step closer to Martha, eyes narrowing. "You were going to push me out too, weren't you?" Martha's face twisted into a mask of indignation. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. But Rachel wasn't having any of it. "Oh my God," Rachel breathed, stepping forward. You were. That's why you kept saying that the baby was the only thing that mattered. She turned to David now, her voice rising with panic. You lied to me. You all lied to me. David stiffened. His face went pale as the truth that Rachel had just spoken started to sink in. Rachel, let's talk about this later, he said, his voice tight, as though trying to calm the situation down. But Rachel wasn't backing off. No, she spat, her voice cracking. No, I'm done. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I could see the looks on the guests' faces. Utter shock, confusion, disbelief. But I was done. I wasn't walking away anymore. Not until I had everything. And as Rachel stood there, spiraling, I realized one thing. This wasn't just about a wedding, a dress, or a man. This was about control. It always had been. And it was time for me to take back mine. Whispered words echoed in the air as I stared at him. You said you loved me. I whispered, my voice barely audible, but still carrying the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. David's face faltered for a brief second, but he didn't speak. Martha scoffed beside him. Love doesn't matter, she spat, her tone icy. Family matters. The word stung, but it was Rachel's sudden shift that broke me. The anger that had been brewing inside her for so long suddenly exploded. She didn't even give us the courtesy of a response. Instead, with a sharp, swift movement, she yanked off the veil that had symbolized the finality of her sacrifice and threw it at Martha's feet, like a symbol of all the years she had been manipulated, used, and silenced. I could see it all in Rachel's face. Her betrayal, her pain, and the exhaustion of carrying it all. She laughed, bitter and sharp, a sound that made my heart ache for her. I was just another pawn, she choked out, her voice cracking with emotion. The words hit me with a sudden clarity I hadn't expected. Just like her, Rachel added, pointing at me. And in that moment, I realized something devastating. Rachel wasn't my replacement. She hadn't been taking my place in David's life. No, Rachel had been me. She had fallen for it, just like I had. The difference was I had walked away before it was too late. Rachel hadn't had that chance, and now it was too late for her too. Rachel wiped the tears from her eyes, her chest rising with each heavy breath as she turned and walked away without another word. The silence that followed her departure was suffocating, but it was David who broke it. Rachel. His voice cracked as he called after her, his panic palpable. Wait. Rachel, please, just listen. But she didn't stop. She didn't even turn around. Martha, however, wasn't silent. She spun around, her eyes flashing with fury as she pointed an accusing finger at me. This is your fault, she screamed, her voice rising with anger. You ruined everything. My head spun with confusion for a moment. I blinked. My fault. I repeated incredulously. How is this my fault? She jabbed a finger toward my chest, the accusation seething from her. If you had just left quietly, none of this would have happened, she snapped, her voice bitter and filled with rage. I shook my head in disbelief. You really don't get it, do you? I said, my voice steady now, the anger simmering underneath but controlled. David didn't love me, and guess what? He doesn't love Rachel either. The truth hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. I could see it in her eyes, the realization starting to sink in. Martha had controlled every aspect of David's life, held him on a leash for so long that he'd never realized what it meant to truly live. But now, she had finally ruined everything. David's jaw clenched as he stood there, frozen, silent, pathetic. He was a man who had lost everything, but he didn't have the courage to say anything, to admit the truth, to fight back. He was just a man who had finally seen what he had been blind to for so long. The destruction caused by his own inaction. I could have taken this moment to bury him, to destroy him with one final brutal remark that would have shattered him completely. I could have made him feel every ounce of humiliation he deserved, but it wasn't worth it. None of them were worth the effort. Not anymore. So I stepped back. I took a deep breath, then turned to my lawyer who had been standing quietly, observing it all. Let's go, I said, my voice cold and decisive. He nodded, adjusting his tie and following me without hesitation. We'll send the final paperwork later, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. I walked away then. Down the aisle I was supposed to walk down in a white dress, but there was no wedding, no promises, just the whispers of stunned guests behind me, the sharp, furious face of Martha still burning in my mind. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. David tried to contact me. Of course. His messages were pathetic, filled with desperate pleas and empty promises. "Can we talk?" he asked. I made a mistake. I just need a chance to explain. But I never responded. Not once. Rachel disappeared after that. No one really knew where she went or what became of her. She moved away, left a life that had kept her trapped, and moved out of state. She never looked back. And Martha? Well, she didn't escape the consequences. She lost everything. David, for all his faults, had been her ticket to a life of control, power, and status. But when his world came crashing down, so did hers. His business deals collapsed. His reputation, once untouchable, was tarnished beyond repair. People stopped trusting him, and when Martha's own reputation began to crumble with him, she couldn't save herself. I heard that she moved away to start fresh. She left David behind and tried to rebuild her life. But the damage was done. Karma had already done its work. She had lost everything, just like David, just like Rachel. As for me, I thrived. I found a new city, a new life. I found a job I loved, friends who actually cared about me, and the freedom I had been yearning for. No more lies. No more manipulation. No more pretending to be someone I wasn't just to please others. I stopped looking back. I stopped caring about the people who tried to control me. And I stopped caring about the life they had tried to force on me. Because the truth is, I won. Not because I sought revenge. Not because I humiliated them or made them pay for what they did to me. But because I walked away. Because I found a life so much better than the one they had trapped me in. And now, when I look back on that day, the wedding, the betrayal, the hurt, it doesn't affect me. I don't feel anything at all. And that's the best revenge of all.